Tonight's story begins on the coldest night the frontier had ever known, a night when the very air seemed to crack and splinter. A dying Apache woman stumbled out of the blizzard and collapsed at the gate of a forgotten ranch. And a solitary cowboy, a man who had long since made peace with his own emptiness, made a choice that would shatter the lonely silence of his world forever. What happened next will test your faith, mend your spirit, and prove that even in the most frozen of hearts, a single act of compassion can ignite a flame that defies the dark. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who needs to see the light in the darkness, and tell me in the comments where you're joining us from. Let's get started. The wind screamed across the desolate plains like a chorus of lost souls, whipping the snow into a blinding, white fury that sought to bury all signs of life. Ice clung to the skeletal branches of the trees, and the moon was a pale, drowned ghost behind the storm clouds. In the heart of this frozen oblivion stood a lone homestead, a dark and silent silhouette clinging stubbornly to the land, where a man named Elias Grant lived with more regrets than company. On a night such as this, no living thing should have been abroad. Yet destiny cares little for what should be. Inside the cramped cabin, Elias sat hunched by the feeble glow of a hearth, running a whetstone along the edge of a worn skinning knife. The rhythmic scrape of steel was a feeble counterpoint to the storm's roar. The fire spat and hissed, fighting a losing battle against the cold that seeped through the walls. Elias was not a man easily unnerved, but these long, isolated nights had a way of breathing life into old shadows. His gaze was distant, his hands calloused maps of a hard life, and his spirit had grown as quiet and still as the land outside. That was when he heard it, a dull, hollow thump against the heavy wooden gate. At first Elias dismissed it as the wind, a deadfall branch torn loose and tossed against the fence. But the sound came again, weaker this time, a soft, final sort of sound, like a last hope being extinguished. Elias was on his feet in an instant. There was an unmistakable weight to that noise, a desperation that cut through the storm's mindless rage. Shrugging into his heavy coat and snatching his rifle from its pegs, he shoved the door open and stepped into the killing cold. The wind stole his breath, driving icy needles into his skin. He squinted, raising a hand to shield his eyes as they scanned the whiteness. And then he saw her. A small, dark shape was curled against the base of the gate, nearly swallowed by the drifting snow. For a heart-stopping moment, Elias thought he was looking at a corpse, so still and lifeless she seemed. He crunched forward, his boots plunging deep, and dropped to his knees beside the fallen stranger. Snow was matted in her long, black hair like shattered glass. Her lips were a terrifying shade of violet, and her simple deerskin dress was torn and crusted with ice, telling a silent story of a brutal journey. When Elias brushed the frozen crystals from her cheek, his own heart lurched. She was young, an Apache woman, her body hovering on the very precipice of death. Her eyes were half open, but saw nothing, her hands curled into frozen claws. A faint, ragged sigh escaped her lips, a sound more of surrender than breath. Elias didn't hesitate. He slid his arms beneath her, shocked at how little she weighed, like carrying a bundle of kindling, and lifted her against his chest. He carried her into the cabin, and the moment the door shut, the wave of warmth struck her. A low, pained moan escaped her throat, the first sign of feeling returning. Elias laid her as close to the fire as he dared, swaddling her in every blanket he owned, tucking his own thick coat around her shoulders. Her breathing was a shallow, frantic flutter, a fragile thread tethering her to life. Elias pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, searching for a pulse. It was there, a faint, frantic tapping against his skin, so weak it threatened to vanish with his next heartbeat. But he had seen men at the edge before, and he knew this one still had a fight left in her. He set water to boil, crushed dried herbs into a tin cup, and returned to her side. Gently, he cradled her head and coaxed her to sip the warm, bitter tea. Her body was seized with violent, uncontrollable shivers, her teeth chattering as life warred with the cold inside her. For a long time she could not speak, her eyes darting around the shadowy cabin, wide with confusion and a deep, ingrained fear. Elias said nothing. He recognized that kind of terror, the kind that came from having trust broken too many times. Finally, her voice emerged, a dry, broken whisper that was barely audible over the crackling fire. Why did you bring me in?" Elias didn't answer right away. He placed another log on the fire, watching the flames leap and devour it. Then he turned and met her haunted gaze. "Because you were at my gate," he said, his voice low and steady. "And no one should be left outside on a night like this." She stared at him, her expression one of pure, uncomprehending shock, as if he had just spoken in a tongue forgotten by the world. As the night wore on, a faint flush of color slowly returned to her cheeks. Her breathing deepened, steadied, and finally, exhaustion overpowered her, pulling her into a fitful, trembling sleep. Elias kept his vigil, replenishing the blankets, stoking the fire, watching over her. He did not know her name, her story, or what demons might be on her trail. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Bringing her back from the ice was all that existed in the world. By morning, the storm had exhausted its fury, leaving behind a world encased in glassy, silent white. Inside the cabin, the Apache woman finally stirred, her consciousness returning like a slow tide. She tried to push herself up, but a sharp gasp of pain escaped her as her body protested, every muscle and bruise screaming in unison. Elias was at her side in an instant, his hand a steadying presence on her shoulder. "Easy now," he murmured. "The cold takes its own toll. You need to rest." She hesitated, then nodded, her dark eyes studying him with a mix of wariness and dawning clarity. When she could finally speak, her voice was still rough, but stronger. "I am Liwanu," she said. The name meant growling bear, a stark contrast to her fragile state. The story spilled out in halting fragments. Her small band had been ambushed by scalp hunters, ruthless men who saw her people as walking currency. She had fought, creating a diversion so the others could flee into the mountains, but was struck down and left for dead in the snow. For 2 days she had wandered, using the last of her strength to follow the faint promise of smoke from his chimney. She looked down at her hands, ashamed. "I came to your gate with nothing, not even strength to stand." Elias shook his head, his jaw set. "You don't need to offer anything," he said. "A person in need is reason enough." His words seemed to strike a chord deep within her, and she fell silent, the simplicity of his logic a foreign concept in her world of constant struggle. Over the next hours, she drank the broth he offered and allowed her body to thaw fully by the fire. Elias noted the old scars that crosshatched her arms, the fresh bruises on her legs, and the way her eyes would flicker to the window at the slightest sound. She was not just recovering, she was waiting. "What is it you're listening for?" Elias finally asked, his voice low, her lips pressed into a thin line. "The men who did this, they do not like to lose their quarry. If they find my tracks—" She trailed off, the unspoken consequence hanging heavily in the warm air. Elias didn't need her to finish. He understood the nature of predators. He placed a hand firmly on the table. "You are under my roof. That makes you my responsibility. No one will take you from here." The firmness in his voice seemed to startle her. But as he looked at her, sitting small yet unyielding before the fire, he knew with a cold certainty that the nightmare she fled was not over. And when it arrived at his door, he would be there to meet it, because in her defiant eyes, he saw a reflection of his own battered will to survive. And for the first time in years, that was a reason to stand firm. The day grew quieter, the world hushed under its thick, white blanket. But Liwanu's fear did not settle. She sat near the window, Elias's heaviest wool blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, her eyes constantly scanning the distant, snow-blanketed hills, as if she could see the shadows that hunted her already forming there. Elias pretended not to notice, giving her the space to wrestle with her demons, but his own instincts were a live wire. He had survived too long on the frontier to believe in coincidences or clean escapes. Danger was a patient hunter. It followed a scent for miles, and Liwanu's tense silence was a louder warning than any shout. By late afternoon, a subtle shift occurred. The wind died down to a whisper, The snow lay still and deep, and the sky lightened to a pale, washed-out gray. Yet, the air itself felt charged, thick with a looming wrongness. Needing to move, to act, Elias pulled on his coat and stepped outside under the guise of checking on the horses in the lean-to. His breath plumed in the crystalline air as his eyes, narrowed and practiced, swept the horizon. And that was when he saw them. 3 riders, dark specks against the vast white, moving with a slow, deliberate purpose along the distant ridge. They weren't lost. They weren't passing through. They were searching, cutting a methodical pattern back and forth, like wolves on a trail. Elias's chest tightened into a hard knot. He didn't need Liwanu to tell him who they were. The scalp hunters had tracked their quarry through the very storm that should have hidden her. They were circling now, patient and cruel, waiting for the right moment to close in. He turned and walked back into the cabin, his boots heavy with packed snow and a dread that felt like a physical weight. Liwanu looked up the moment he entered. Her hand flew to the back of the wooden chair, her knuckles white as she gripped it, bracing for impact. "They found me, didn't they?" she whispered, the words barely audible. Elias gave a single grim nod. Her breath hitched, a ragged, terrified sound. She stood up abruptly, her body trembling. "I should go. If I leave now, lead them away, maybe they will leave you alone." Elias moved faster than she expected, stepping squarely in front of the door, blocking her path. "You're not going anywhere," he said. His voice was low, but it carried an absolute, unshakable finality that silenced any protest before it could form. Liwanu stared at him, her dark eyes wide with pure, uncomprehending disbelief. "Men do not risk their lives for people like me," she breathed, the words filled with the bitter wisdom of her experience. Elias shook his head, his gaze steady on hers. "I'm not other men." He turned from her then, moving through the small cabin with a calm, methodical efficiency that spoke of a man who had faced down terrors far worse than bad weather. He took his heavy rifle from its pegs above the fireplace, checked the load with a practiced hand, and ensured his revolver was seated securely in his belt. He tested the shutters, securing the latch on the one window. Liwanu watched him, her initial shock giving way to a stunned, bewildered silence. She could not fathom it, why a stranger, a white man living alone on the edge of nothing, would choose to stand against 3 armed and vicious men for her sake, a woman who had come to him with nothing. "You do not have to do this," she murmured, her voice cracking with emotion. He didn't turn around, his focus on the world outside the window. "Maybe I do," he said quietly. "Not for you. Because it's the right thing to do." The riders approached slowly, finally reining in their horses just beyond the split-rail gate. Elias took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped onto the porch, the rifle held loosely but ready in his hands. His broad silhouette was stark against the fading afternoon light. The leader of the hunters, a man with a face carved from cruelty and a livid scar running from his temple to his jaw, grinned, a predatory flash of yellow teeth. "Evenin', homesteader," the man called out, his voice oily. "We're just looking for something that belongs to us." Elias didn't blink. "Nothing here belongs to you." The scarred man chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. "An Apache squaw came through this way. Skinny thing, but plenty of fire in her. She's ours." Elias's grip tightened on the rifle stock, his knuckles bleaching white. "She's not property. You're not taking her." The raiders exchanged amused, contemptuous looks. The leader spat a stream of tobacco into the pristine snow at his feet. "You plannin' to die for her, then?" Daniel didn't answer with words. He answered with a single deliberate step forward, his eyes locked on the leaders, his entire posture a silent, unwavering dare. The air grew thick and heavy, tense enough to snap. The other 2 riders shifted, their hands drifting toward their own weapons. The leader's smirk widened. "Suit yourself, fool." Before the man could clear his holster, a sharp thwip shattered the tense silence. An arrow embedded itself in the snow, inches from the leader's boot, its shaft still vibrating. All 3 men jerked in shock, turning their heads toward the cabin doorway. Liwanu stood there, holding Elias's old hunting bow, her body trembling, but her aim steady. She stepped forward to stand beside Elias, her chin held high. "I will not be taken again," she declared, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the cold air. Elias didn't look at her, but he shifted his stance slightly, positioning his body as a shield in front of hers. The leader's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of rage. He snarled and raised his pistol. The moment stretched, thin and brittle as ice, a final breath held before the storm breaks. Then everything exploded. Elias fired first, his shot a sharp crack that knocked the pistol spinning from the leader's grip. The horses reared in panic, the other two raiders scrambling for cover. One tried to fire a rifle from behind his saddle, but Elias's second shot was faster, hitting the rifle barrel and sending the man's bullet harmlessly into the snow. The third raider, enraged, charged forward on foot, a long skinning knife raised high. Liwanu, shaking but brave, knocked another arrow, drew the bowstring back to her cheek, and let it fly. The arrow struck the charging man high in the shoulder, spinning him around with a grunt of pain and sending him stumbling backward into a snowdrift. Elias stepped to the edge of the porch, his rifle aimed squarely at the leader's chest. "Leave now," he commanded, his voice low and deadly. The raiders hesitated, their faces contorted with hatred and stunned disbelief. The leader clutched his bleeding hand, cursing viciously under his breath. "This ain't over, cowboy," he spat. Elias raised the rifle higher, the barrel unwavering. "It is for today." After a tense, endless moment, the men mounted their skittish horses and retreated, kicking up plumes of snow as they disappeared over the ridge, swallowed by the gathering dusk. When they were truly gone, Elias finally lowered the rifle, the adrenaline draining from him, leaving him feeling hollow and tired. Liwanu's bow slipped from her numb fingers and clattered onto the porch. Her entire body began to tremble violently, a reaction to the fear, relief, and shock crashing over her all at once. Elias turned and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said softly. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes and spilling over, tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "You risked everything for me. Your life for nothing." Elias took a slow, deep breath, the cold air burning in his lungs. "You were alone. You were afraid. You were hunted," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been all those things. And no one stepped in to help me. That's why I helped you." His words shattered the last of her defenses. A broken sob escaped her, then another. She covered her face with her hands and wept, releasing all the terror and sorrow she had held inside for so long. Elias didn't try to hush her or offer empty comforts. He simply stood beside her, a solid, silent presence, until the storm of her tears had passed and her breathing evened out. Together, they walked back into the cabin as the sky outside turned a deep, peaceful blue, and the fire inside began to glow with a renewed warmth. For the first time since she had stumbled to his gate, Liwanu felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames in the hearth. It was safety. It was trust. It was the fragile, undeniable seedling of hope. Over the next several days, she healed in a way that went beyond her physical wounds. The bruises on her skin faded from angry purples to soft yellows and greens. Her voice lost its fearful tremor and steadied. The constant, hunted look in her eyes slowly dissolved, replaced by a cautious but growing peace. Elias repaired her torn moccasins with sturdy stitches, shared his simple meals without ceremony, and showed her how he tended to the horses. In return, she helped him with the daily chores, mended his worn shirts with a neatness he lacked, and once, while watching a coyote pup play clumsily in the melting snow, she even laughed, a soft, musical sound that Elias realized he hadn't heard from anyone in more years than he could count. Their silent companionship grew naturally, organically, like two wounded spirits, slowly learning how to breathe in unison again. When the snow finally began its earnest retreat, revealing patches of dark, wet earth, and the sun lingered a little longer each afternoon, Liwanu stood outside the cabin and looked toward the distant mountains, her homeland. She knew her people were likely still out there, scattered and surviving. Daniel stepped out to stand beside her, following her gaze. "You miss them," he said gently, not a question, but an understanding. She nodded, her eyes still on the horizon. But then she turned to look at him, her expression filled with a soft, profound gratitude. "You saved me," she said, "when I had nothing left, not even the strength to stand." Elias met her gaze, his own usually hard eyes soft. "You had your life," he replied. "That was always enough for me to fight for." Her heart swelled with an emotion so vast and warm she never expected to feel it again. She reached out, her fingers finding his, and laced them together. "If I find my people," she asked, her voice barely a whisper, "will you come visit someday?" Elias looked down at their joined hands, and a rare, quiet smile touched his lips, softening the lines of his face. "If you want me to," he said, "I will." She squeezed his hand, her tears now ones of bittersweet joy, shining in the late afternoon light. "I want you to." That very day, Liwanu gathered the few things she had and prepared to leave the ranch to search for her tribe. She did not leave as the broken, frozen victim who had arrived, but as a woman reborn from the ice, her spirit tempered and strengthened by the kindness she had found. And Elias watched her go, a solitary figure growing smaller against the vast landscape, with a heart he had believed was permanently frozen now feeling a strange, aching warmth. They did not say goodbye. They didn't need to. The bond forged between them was something stronger than distance, something welded in the fire of crisis, the storm of fear, and the simple, stubborn act of survival. And though their paths now diverged, heading toward different futures, both of them carried a piece of the other's strength forward into the world. Two lives saved on one frozen night, when an act of mercy changed everything forever.